By the mid-2000s, the Ace Combat franchise was riding high. Namco had released 5 numbered games in the span of 9 years, and sales and critical reception alike had been great for every single one, aside from the international release of Ace Combat 3. So with a new successful franchise under their belt, Namco did what just about all publishers did in the mid-2000s. Licensed the name out to an external studio to make a handheld spin-off. They ended up giving the license for the game to Humansoft, a studio based out of Hungary that was well known for porting well-established franchises onto devices like the Game Boy and the DS. And I'm particularly interested in this game since it's one of the least discussed titles, if not the least discussed one out of the entire franchise. So, is Ace Combat Advance a game that deserves to be remembered, or is it just another haphazardly thrown together Game Boy spin-off worth leaving in the past? Well, let's talk about it. And before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 6th in a series of videos where I'm playing every Ace Combat game for the first time and reviewing them as I go along. And while you don't have to have seen the rest of the videos in order to enjoy this one, you'll be missing a lot of important context about my journey with the series if you haven't seen them. So I'll have the full playlist linked in the description below for those of you that want to go check those out first. But with that out of the way, Ace Combat Advance is a handheld spin-off of the Ace Combat series developed by Humansoft and published by Namco for the Game Boy Advance in 2005. And I know that some of you who have been keeping up with the series are probably confused about why I'm covering this game before wrapping up the PS2 trilogy with Ace Combat Zero, but I always do these series in release order, so here we are. Anyway, Ace Combat Advance takes place in the year 2032, placing it closer to Ace Combat 3 than any other game in the series chronologically. In the year 2032, large corporations have already replaced world governments and become economic superpowers, with one of these corporations being General Resource Limited from Ace Combat 3. General Resource has been using their state-of-the-art military equipment to destroy anybody who could potentially pose a threat to their economic and political strength, so an unnamed international military is created to fight back. We play as an unnamed ace pilot for this military and are tasked with destroying General Resource's military resources in order to reduce their power. And as far as the story goes, that's about it, with Humansoft opting for the give them a basic baseline and just let them blow shit up approach of the early PS1 titles. So with that already out of the way, let's get on to the rest of the game. To my surprise, the gameplay here completely ditches the 3D flight that the series is known for, and instead opts for more of a top-down shooter approach. Honestly, this makes a lot of sense considering how difficult it was to create a 3D game on the Game Boy, but it still caught me off guard nonetheless. And thanks to this perspective change, Ace Combat Advance plays like a game from an entirely different series. In Ace Combat Advance, the left and the right buttons of the D-pad will rotate your plane left or right, but the up and down buttons probably don't work the way that you would expect. By holding up on the D-pad, your plane will actually take a nosedive and start flying very close to the ground, allowing you to either dodge missiles or get close enough to ground targets to actually hit them with your machine guns. And by pressing down on the D-pad, you'll swap between your standard missiles and whatever special weapon you've chosen to bring with you for that mission. And with this new control scheme, the game has a completely unique type of gameplay compared to the others in the series. When it comes to air-to-air combat, you can hold the A button to fire your machine guns, and these will fire out in a straight line towards wherever your plane is facing. And by pressing B, you can fire either your standard missiles or your special weapon depending on which one you have equipped at that time. What I found interesting though is that for air-to-air combat, unless you have a jet with special air-to-air missiles, machine guns are actually the easier option for shooting down planes. It takes a whole 3 missiles to shoot an enemy plane down in this game, and since the machine guns shoot in a straight line and have pretty good damage, they generally end up being the better option of the two. That being said, I finally realized during the last couple missions of the game that there was nothing stopping me from using both at the same time, allowing me to shoot down enemy planes incredibly quickly. But firing at ground targets feels a little weird here. Since there's no lock-on mechanic present in AC Advance, you have to use that nosedive mechanic I mentioned before to be able to shoot at ground targets. That, or you could just use air-to-ground missiles or bombs to shoot at them from any height. So because of this, I ended up using planes equipped with these sorts of special weapons for almost the entire game because it's so much easier to just use one button press rather than nosedive, aim, and shoot. And speaking of selecting planes, let's talk a little about the progression of the game. To earn new aircraft in this game, you simply complete certain missions in the campaign just like in Ace Combat 3, but all the best jets in the game are earned through completing optional secondary objectives in these missions. Along with this, the feature from Ace Combat 4 allowing you to select whatever special weapon you want to bring returns in this game, but with a slight difference. Rather than being able to purchase 1 or 2 different special weapons for each plane, each jet here just has a set selection of special weapons to choose from. Something else that you'll notice if you play the game for yourself is that the early game jets have way less options when it comes to special weapons, and the late game jets often have all of them available. And something that's particularly interesting is how they've brought over the air-to-air and air-to-ground stats from the console games. Typically in the Ace Combat series, these stats affect your lock-on speed against these respective targets, but there is no lock-on in Ace Combat Advance. So instead, they've made it so that these stats affect your carrying capacity of certain types of special weapons. So if you're flying a plane with a higher air-to-ground stat, you'll be able to carry more bombs and vice versa. This makes it so that even though some planes can be equipped with enhanced air-to-air missiles, they might have a low air-to-air stat, leading you to only be able to carry 10 or so missiles anyway, meaning you're probably better off choosing a different jet for that mission. However, this is almost immediately made redundant by the addition of a manual resupply mechanic. By pressing the select button, you can call in a resupply and repair plane at any time during the mission, and then simply go to the meeting point to completely refill your health and ammo. These resupplies don't have any sort of limit placed on them, so you effectively have infinite health and ammo in this game as long as you learn how to manage the feature properly. But of course, it is slightly balanced by the mission structure itself. Much like the PS2 games, Ace Combat Advance has a campaign that is played in one linear order rather than using branching paths or decision points. Also carried over is the mission timer that Ace Combat 4 and 5 employed, but these timers are much more strict than their PS2 counterparts. The average mission timer here is 4 to 5 minutes long, with the longest in the entire game being 8 minutes. This leads to players needing to rush through their objectives faster than in any other Ace Combat game up to this point, and honestly, I'm a really big fan of this. The timer has always been there, whether it's a literal timer or a fuel gauge, but it's always been so generous to the point that it's not really a concern. Here in AC Advance though, I need to make sure that I'm quickly moving through my objectives, figuring out what targets I need to eliminate and which ones I can afford to leave alive, and ultimately I failed more missions to not doing them quickly enough than I did to getting shot down in this game. And to add to that, these mission timers also make it much more difficult to try to squeeze in those secondary objectives to unlock additional aircraft like I mentioned earlier. It's surprisingly good stuff and made me realize that I might actually like to see the mission timers made a little more strict in the PS2 games. And in general, the high speed and pace of Ace Combat Advance shocked me. When I think back to the Game Boy days of my childhood, I remember games that were fun, but that were pretty primitive for the time. But playing this game, I was completely caught off guard by just how fast and hectic the gameplay actually was. You can even move, use your afterburners, and fire at enemies all while getting resupplied, meaning that even during what you would expect to be some of the slowest moments of the game, the pace of the gameplay is unrelenting. The only thing that slows the pace of the gameplay down is the new limit that's been placed on your afterburners. For whatever reason, your afterburners are now limited by this pseudo fuel gauge that regenerates over time when they aren't being used. It's interesting to me that they decided to put a limit on the player's speed, especially when everything else in the game only pushes players into a more speed-centric playstyle. It's just really bizarre since it's the only mechanic in the game that clashes with its core design so directly. The other large flaw that I feel Ace Combat Advance has is its lack of mission variety. The game only has 12 missions, and the vast majority of them involve simply destroying ground targets until your objective is complete. And as I mentioned earlier, I would always use air-to-ground missiles or bombs whenever I had a lot of ground targets to deal with, so there were only like 2 missions out of the whole game that I didn't use them on. And even in the last mission, the final boss of the game is A, optional, and B, just an extra large plane that has a massive health bar that I still burned through within like 2 sweeps of shooting at it. All things considered, the gameplay was really weird to get used to here coming off of the rest of the series, but once it clicks, it's actually really fun. It doesn't have anywhere near the depth that the rest of the franchise does, but the pure fun factor is definitely there. And I haven't said it yet, but the sprite work in this game is also quite good. Some Game Boy titles are really pleasant to look at, and some not so much, but thankfully AC Advance is pretty easy on the eyes. I think its big weakness visually is probably the backgrounds, but all the plane and ground target sprites actually look quite good in my opinion. Overall, Ace Combat Advance is a weird game to judge. It's a really fun game to play for short sessions as a little distraction, and it doesn't outstay its welcome either, taking me a little less than 2 hours to complete, but when looking at it compared to the rest of the series, it's nothing like what the other games strive to be. Judged on its own merit as a Game Boy title, it's actually pretty damn good, but judged as an Ace Combat game, it's really hard to score. So before giving my score, I really want to emphasize that I don't think the game is bad by any means, but I do think that it fails to capture the spirit of the games that it's based on. While I feel like it's important to keep in mind that I am reviewing a handheld game and it has more limitations because of that, it's also important to remember that this is a licensed tie-in to an existing franchise, and so it needs to be reviewed and scored as an entry in that franchise. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Ace Combat Advance a 5.6. But what do you guys think? Those of you that have played the game, those of you learning about it for the first time through this video, let me know in the comments below. And if you guys enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like, a comment, a subscription, anything to let me and the algorithm know that you did enjoy. It helps me out a lot, so I'd really appreciate it. And if you're interested in supporting the channel financially, consider checking out becoming a channel member or a patron. They start as low as $1 a month and can get you things like behind the scenes updates, early video access, and more. But if you can't afford to, don't worry about it. We've all been there, and your likes, comments, etc. already help out the videos plenty. And hey, if you enjoyed this video and you haven't seen them already, then you definitely enjoy the rest of my Ace Combat videos, or maybe even another series we recently started doing the exact same thing for the Metal Gear franchise. So if you're interested, I'll have both of those linked right here on screen.